Martin Entz is a professor in the University of Manitoba's Plant Science Department. He received his PhD from the University of Saskatchewan in career. Martin teaches courses in crop production and often hosts a summer institute at the U of M Carmen campus. Martin has led agricultural projects in Central America, Zimbabwe, East Africa, and North Korea. When I said continental, I was wrong. It's global. You are a global leader. Martin is a member of the Prairie Food Vision Network, of the 2020 Rockefeller Foundation Food Systems Vision Prize. Martin's presentation, Nature as a Guide, includes the themes of human adaptation to the prairie, prairie landscape modification, crop livestock integration, plant genetics, resources, migration, and land governance. And just, it says I'm supposed to welcome you now, but I have one more thing I wanted to say. I can't say that I interact with Martin Entz a lot, but every now and then I get a chance to talk to him, and it was on the basis of one conversation with Dr. Entz that a category got inserted into the Conservation Trust, and that was soil health. It was not in there as a fundamental consideration, but after I got off the phone with Dr. Entz, I said, how can we not, in the Conservation Trust, grants in the nature of $500,000 went into that area, and we're still trying to figure out the details of how to get it exactly right and doing the best things. But Martin, you've given us a great start. Thank you. Please welcome Dr. Entz. Please.
Thank you very much for those kind words. I go by Martin. It's a pleasure to be here. I can't believe I'm actually in a room full of people. It feels fantastic. I also am really honored to be in among so many people who's put a lot of volunteer time, because I can just imagine the way the watershed groups operate, and a lot of you are involved in other things, and so thank you for volunteering your time to look after the natural resources. It's really important. Okay, now I think I probably know how to work this. Is that how you advance it? There you go. Okay. We've got what, 2.5 hours before supper? There we go. Perfect. Okay, so thanks again for inviting me. There's a lot of different themes that we're sort of pulling together for this talk. I was asked to talk about soil health, and then I looked, watersheds. Well, we better broaden it beyond that. And so I put a title in that sort of captures everything. Agricultural systems to facilitate healthy soils. It's very important. But I think they need to be guided by how nature works. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. It's going to be a little detailed, I'm sorry. And then I think we need to recognize that we're trying to be in the post-colonial era. Now, the picture I have here on your left is kind of where agriculture is today, interested in intensive cropping all over the world. And actually crop diversity has gone down in Canada. We're now growing more acres of fewer crops. What we want to do is we want to think about landscapes, and we want to go to a watershed-focused food system. And we're in good company. I mean, Europe wants to go 30% organic by 2030 because Germany does, because driving will intensify, I think, in the future. So let's get going. Okay, chapter 1. But there's basically 3 things about soils we think about. The chemical properties, your soil tests, how much nitrogen, how much phosphorus, how much pH, your physical properties, what's the aggregation, what happens when you use certain tillage or have certain rotations. And then the newest kid on the block is the biological part. And so most soil science departments, certainly when Mr. Poyser would have been involved in soil science. There were not soil biologists in Canadian universities, and I think the first one was hired like in the late 1970s, 80s. But that's an area of tremendous interest. So we got those three areas. And so within those selected by the Soil Health Institute, it's a group in North Carolina. And what they did is they picked 121 long-term studies in North America, Canada, US, Mexico, and subjected them to all the soil health measurements. So they got a large foundation grant. And so I lead the Glenlee rotation, which is going into its 31st year. There's a picture of it. And so in 2018, Soil Health Institute scientists combined with our staff to do an analysis of not only our rotation study, but 16 others in Canada and a bunch around North America. So I've got a long list of data on water infiltration, just a whole bunch of things. But the number one factor that was driving soil health in this very extensive study was soil organic matter. Probably not a surprise to people who live on the land. Organic matter is really important. People talk about organic matter. Sometimes they talk about soil carbon. Soil organic matter is about 58% carbon, just so you know, so you can make that transition. So if you got, 2 units of carbon, you've got close to 4% organic matter. Okay, so I actually that Ted Poyser did work on organic matter at the plots at the University of Manitoba. Can you hear me okay? I feel like I'm spitting into this thing. Sometimes when I get excited, my wife said, it's okay, not so loud, I'm right here. So, okay. So right where the fertility fields were, that's where the Winnipeg Blue Bombers beat the Saskatchewan Roughriders barely the other day. Those used to be the fertility fields. And Ted Poyser looked at the soil carbon in these fields in different crop rotations. I'm sorry that they ended this study. It would have been great if been continued. But, so there's some of the data. And what we know at that early time of the last century, organic matter levels were going down all over the world. Once you break grassland soil, you're going to bring it down to a new equilibrium. But it's important that they measured it and they found out that adding farmyard manure and having legumes in the rotation actually slowed down the decline of organic matter. So we've known a lot about soil organic matter for a long time. This is the oldest crop rotation study in North America at the University of Illinois. It's still going today, started in 1876. It's called the Morrow plots, and if you go online, you can find a fantastic description of it. And what they're looking at here is the soil organic carbon from about 1904 up to about 1998. And you can see, again, in the early part of the last century, the organic matter is declining. That's what happens when you break a grassland soil. It doesn't matter if you're no-tilling or tilling or whatever. And then, but you can see the rotation at the top that had corn, oats and other things and forage in the rotation. It stabilized at a much level of soil carbon. And so this is something that we know rotation matters, right? And perennials matter. But it's really interesting to take a look at this data. And right now there's a lot of interest in increasing soil organic carbon, organic matter. But here's some fantastic data looking at the top graph is the topsoil, and the bottom graph is the next layer down. I think probably 0 to 6 inches, 6 to 12, I'm guessing. Between 1913 and 1923. And so on your left is the corn soybean or the continuous corn rotation, and on the middle is the corn oat rotation. On the right, it's been 1923, it would have been 60 years after they started the rotation. So again, rotation matters. What's also interesting to me is that in the continuous corn and then in the bottom layer and the deeper soil layer, the organic matter is still going down between 1913 and 1923. Sometimes we get very enthusiastic about building it up, and we have to recognize that it's very hard to do. But again, some historical data. This is some data from Australia. From Institute, where I spent a little bit of time studying, and I walked by this up, and the next layer, the bottom line is the next layer. And as the frequency of summer fallow goes up, the soil carbon goes down. So we've really got a lot of good information. And then recently, we've been more interested in not only the surface carbon, what's happening deeper down. So this is a graduate student of mine. We worked on the longest running crop rotation study in South America, which was in Uruguay. And we found out that between 40 and 60 centimeters, a rotation that had 4 years of pasture and then 4 years of grain, after about 60 years, we had a 19% increase in subsoil carbon. So lots is known. We can glean a lot of wisdom from this. Perennials are very important to bringing carbon deeper in the soil. And also, we spent a lot of time talking about subsoil carbon. We also need to start thinking more about subsoil, about carbon deeper in the soil. You can tell I love crop rotation studies. My goal at one point was to visit all of the long-term studies around the world. I will not achieve that goal, but I'll try. This is the oldest running field experiment in the modern era, anyways, that we know of. It's at Watersheds, England. It was started in 1843 by people interested in selling nitrogen fertilizer. And they were basically interested in how could we grow continuous wheat and feed it with nutrients. So, and Gilbert and Laws, who started this rotation, actually visited Brandon, visited Winnipeg, visited Selkirk, and visited Calgary. I don't know why they didn't go to Saskatchewan. I think they were not Rider fans. So, can you imagine? They came to Canada because they heard of the amazing grassland soils here. So this is the wheat yield data from Rothamsted, and you can go online and get all this information. These are called the broad bulk plots. And I visited them once, and I lay down in them and just, wanted the soil to get into my hair because it was, that special to me. And you can see what's happened to yields. The blue line at the bottom is continuous wheat, which has never been fertilized. So it still produces about, 1 ton per hectare. Still produces 18 bushels per acre after 150, 180 years. The top line, the orange one, is where they used just nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium fertilizer, and this is, and they actually started rotating the crop. So this is the first wheat crop in the rotation. So yields have gone from 2 tons up to 10 tons per hectare, or whatever, 180, 70 bushels an acre. But what about the soil carbon? Oh, and there's also those manure in there. You can see the green line, which is right along the orange, is where they added less fertilizer but added manure. If we look at the soil carbon information from the Rothamsted plots, the circles or the dots are actual measurements, and then the lines are the modeled data, and they line up pretty well. You can see that NPK line is, it may have produced a high yield, but all really important bits of knowledge. And I think this is the last one I'm going to talk about. This one is in Germany, started in 1902. And they soil area. So the more red you have, the more pore space there is, the more earthworm channels. It's pretty cool, eh? Would you agree? Hey, thanks. It's good to have, a response, because you all have masks on, and and some of you are putting them over your eyes and sleeping, I think. Yeah. And so you can see on the left is the NPK fertilizer, on the right is no fertilizer, but then at the bottom is no manure, and so you can see the value of both manure and fertilizer in improving soil structure. And so and this study is still going on. And in Western Canada, I wrote a paper almost 20 years ago now, and in the Northern Great Plains of the US, there's a number of very nice studies. And when I started at the University of Manitoba, one of the first things I did was to pull this data together and take a look at, how does crop rotation affect soil carbon? And the results are kind of the same as what I showed. And I want to end off chapter 1 with this study, which quite a little bit controversial, and you may have read in the Western Producer that and so this study here is at the University of Guelph, a Laura Research Farm. It's just over 40 years old now, and they've got a number of rotations. So continuous corn, soybean, soybean. They set the rotation up like that for whatever reason. And then the next one, CC, corn, soybean, wheat. And the corn, soybean, they looked at the estimated carbon sequestration. It's actually negative. And the conclusion is that it's not possible to increase soil carbon with a rotation like that. But once wheat was added into that rotation, the soil carbon started moving up. And what they are showing there, if you can see, is after 81 years, you can increase the soil organic matter 1%. That means if you have a soil organic matter 3, now it's 4. Okay. The next rotation down, you're following me? Is it good? Yeah, okay. All right, so corn, soybean, wheat with a red clover cover crop. You can see it's adding more carbon. Now we're down to 62 years to build your soil carbon up. Corn, alfalfa, it's a bit better, and then continuous alfalfa. In 21 years, you can increase the soil carbon by 1%. So it's not to say, they've also got a tillage treatment and a no-tillage study. And the no-till doesn't start helping until the rotation is improved. And so when I comment, probably one of the last conferences here before COVID at the organic conference, I said, a little bit of tillage is not going to kill your organic matter. So Ed White or somebody from the Western Producer came at me, and I said, no, that's what the Gulf shows, and Dean got involved. So Bill Dean. So it was interesting. But what we tell the students is that crop rotation is just so important, as is not over-tilling your soil. Now, let me show you some really interesting data from that study, which actually shows you where the carbon is going. This is work of Dr. Claudia Wagner-Riddle at the University of Guelph. And what they're using is equipment like this. We also have a setup like this at the University of Manitoba at the Glenlee Research Station. Ours is the world's longest continuous field scale flux system. And that tower you see there, it's measuring the CO2 and the nitrous oxide shifts every day of the year, winter, summer. It has for over 15 years now. This is Mario Tenuta's program. So when you drive down Highway 75, you're driving by this world-famous place. It's quite interesting. What they've done is looked at the movement of carbon in a corn, soybean rotation versus a corn, soybean, winter wheat with a red clover cover crop. And so what happens is the black goes way down. That's when the corn is growing. It's drawing, there's a net movement of carbon dioxide into the soil. And then the bumps above is when there's a net movement above. And you can look at that cover crop. Isn't that interesting? On your far right, that little bump is the cover crop growing after winter wheat. It actually brings a lot of carbon into the soil. So when I see those farmers bailing off their wheat straw in Manitoba, I go like, that's okay, but you need a little bit of cover crop carbon to backfill that field so that you don't lose soil carbon. And this type of data shows us how that works. And you may have heard Dr. Tenuta talk about this in Manitoba. Does that make sense? You follow that? Do I need to explain? Okay, so you get it. So these flux towers, and here's a picture of them. The one on the top right is those two white things. They measure the concentration of the CO2 and the nitrous oxide every minute moving. So they know whether the stuff's moving up or down. And if it's moving down, that carbon into the plant and putting it in the soil in the root system. So we can really monitor carbon well now. Okay. Is there a question before I go to chapter 2? Does anybody want to, yell out a question or a comment? Sorry? I stopped my talk for that. Well, Mario Tenuta is pretty larger than life. I went to his wedding. And if you think Mario Tenuta was great, Mario is from Toronto, big Italian family. You should have met Uncle Tony. Uncle Tony, we were doing shooters on the way in. Yeah, he had you couldn't, my wife was pregnant. You got to have one anyways, He is great. He's a wonderful colleague. We've done a lot of work together. Okay, chapter 2. What the heck is organic matter and how does it get there? I think this is the boring part of the talk. What is organic matter? Canada actually has among the best soil carbon scientists in the world. Henry Jansen, Ed Gregorich in Ottawa. Henry was at Lethbridge. He's recently retired. Mario Tenuta, many, many others. And so this is a depiction of organic matter. And what I'm wanting to just share concerned about. There's really two parts of organic matter. One is called, other is mineral associated organic. Of a heavy clay you want to pay close one because you've heard of soil aggregation. It's in those aggregates, so it's very important. That's one of the reasons you don't want to overtill your soil. If I ever had a choice between a high-speed disc and a deep tiller for tillage, I'd go with the deep tiller because it does a better job of maintaining aggregates. And if you're a no-till farmer, that's really what you're building up. It's your particulate organic matter. The mineral-associated organic matter, it's a two-stage process. The plant gets eaten by the microbe, and then the microbe dies, and it lives in the clay and the silt particle. And so it's a microbial origin. So it's dead microbial cells embedded in clay. And it requires nitrogen to do that, and that's one of the reasons why legume cover crops are being promoted, because it can help get those microbes into there and stick the carbon in the soil. So here's just a picture, microscopic picture of the work of Lavallée et al. You can see the POM, the POM, the particulate organic matter. They got a sample out of a forest soil, and forest soils have very high levels of particulate organic matter. And then on the right, you can see the mineral-associated organic matter, or MOM, and it's much smaller, and it's basically, if you go right to the bottom, you've got like a silt clay particle, and the dead microbes are stuck to those. The mineral-associated organic matter it lasts way longer. They're both important, but it's really important. This table kind of shows some of the distinctions, and I'm just going to show you one If you look at this, it says mean residence time, the PO a decade, but the M, the mineral associated, can last for centuries. And so you want to increase both. The graph on the right shows the mineral associated organic matter. Oh, this thing got a pointer. Oh, there we go. Wow. This is actually from Europe. This is actually from Europe. And it shows the aerial agriculture here. This is the farmland. Most of the carbon is in the mineral associated organic matter. Okay, that we didn't want to do that. Okay, we didn't want to talk about tractor tires quite yet. Okay, so that's a little bit about those things. So remember, this is the boring part of the lecture. I'm going to make you work through this. Okay, behave yourself. Okay, so to get into the mineral associated organic matter, if you're on a Shiloh sand, southeast of here, you can just close your eyes for a while, because if you have only a sandy soil, you're not going to build up any mineral associated because you've got no minerals. But if you're on a clay soil or a silt soil, or even in the Carman-Morden area, which we call sandier soils, there is a lot of silt in there, and they can definitely absorb this stuff. To get into the mineral associated organic matter, you got to go through the microbes have to eat that carbon. So we call it the eye of the needle. The eye of the needle is the microbial community in the soil. Okay, so that's really important. Roots are much better at getting eaten by microbes and getting into the mineral associated organic matter. And that's why, a plant that has roots that have like legume roots, soybean roots, alfalfa roots, they're very juicy and they're easily put into this system. And this is just data from a study that proves that root carbon, I'll read the top. Soil microbes like root material better than shoot material, and they do a better job of incorporating roots into soil organic matter. And in this study, they also found that in the organic system in California, there was a higher proportion of that carbon, root carbon, going into the soil organic matter in the organic versus conventional. And I'll explain that in a minute. Now, the other way you can get some of that carbon into the mineral associated is by dissolved organic matter. And I know Henry Wilson is in the audience. Henry, put up your hand. Where are you? Or maybe he went home. There he is. Thanks, Henry. This is when Henry was a postdoc at Yale University. He came to Glenlee and sampled. I just came and had lunch with him. I did no work. I'll take no credit for this, but I got my name on the paper, which I appreciated. And what Henry showed is that in the rotation that had alfalfa in it versus the one that only grains, there was actually liquid carbon coming out of the roots being available potentially to be fixed into mineral associated. So you can also get that pathway. And it's because this eye of the needle thing, and this is the new theory and the one that's been well proven, the old humic theory on organic matter, that doesn't apply. That was just an artifact of how we extracted the organic matter. Because we now understand how organic matter works in terms of these microbes, there's a lot of interest in the whole soil biology. So you hear a lot about that. You also hear a lot of nonsense about it, but it's important to think about the biology. Okay. So you got like a handful of carbon from your roots going into your soil. How do you know how much of it's going to stay there? Because the soil respires carbon out, right? It's belching it burps carbon just like a cow burps carbon when she belches, right? The soil and the rumen function exactly the same way. When our microbes are not working efficiently, it's like having a tractor tire that just slips. This is the best analogy I could come up with. And so we have we call it a low carbon use efficiency. Does that make sense? Henry, does it make sense to you? Okay, beautiful. And if you have By the way, I've got my tractor in Beausejour right now waiting for tractor tires, and if anybody can help me out, I'd love to. I'm jealous of this picture of this nice tractor wheel. When the microbes are working efficiently, it's like having a better tractor wheel. You get better traction, so you get better gas mileage in terms of getting stuff done. And here's the proof. This is Cynthia Kallenbach's work. She's now at McGill University, soil science. She worked on the Kellogg long-term study in Michigan for a long time. And on your left, this is the organic and the conventional systems after 30 years. The conventional rotation is corn, soybean, wheat. The organic rotation is exactly the same, except there's a rye crop after the wheat. The total carbon inputs going into the system in organic is less. No big surprise, organic systems just aren't quite as productive. But the soil organic carbon after 30 years was actually higher in the organic. How can that be? That doesn't make any sense. How can fewer total carbon inputs result in more soil organic carbon? Well, she figured it out. The organic soils had higher levels of carbon use efficiency. They had tractor tires that had bigger lugs. They were able to take that handful of carbon and keep it in the soil. And the way that works on the right-hand side is the microbial growth rates were higher in this particular study in the organic system versus the conventional system. And so now when we think about soils, we think about, can we get those microbial growth rates up? And what does it take to do that? And we know what it takes is root carbon. And that's why scientists are saying, is there a way that farmers can design systems that grow a little bit of cover crop after harvest, or better yet, have a perennial, so that your crop, your soil is getting a diet of readily digestible carbon and the microbes will grow. So hopefully that makes sense. But okay, so that was sort of the boring part of the theory. How do you do this in management? Well, the picture on your left is from Kenya. I took this in Kenya, and I love the picture because the colonizing powers in Kenya, the British, arrived and saw that these farmers were intercropping. They had cover crops, and they said, this is not modern, get rid of this. This is backwards farming. You grow corn, fertilize it, And, but it's called lab. It's a semi-perennial, and I thought it was cool. We visited the farm, and the community took us to show us what this woman. You've heard of Gabe Brown, Dirt to Soil. Okay, read the book. Beautiful. And so, he's been doing a lot of cover crops, and he talks a lot about grazing. Central America, where these farmers, on the bottom right, they had essentially an organic system, composted manure, cover crops, neem insecticide. This is their tomato crop. On the other crop on your left has the traditional ways of growing tomato. This is a rotation of tomato, beans, and corn. And they had a volcano that year. There's volcanoes in that area, and put a lot of stress on the crops. And this is, these soil health measures do pay off for farmers. And then, what about the question of grazing? And if you go through the literature, what you learn very quickly is that if land is overgrazed, which means grazing before the plant has had a chance to recover from grazing, from the previous grazing, that's not going to help the field. Actually increases the soil carbon. So this is work of Franz Luber's in Georgia, but similar work has been done in Alberta. A little bit of this kind of work in Canada. And what they did is took a 5-year Bermuda grass crop. You see the data there, where they hayed it. They got 0.3 tons per hectare of carbon per year. Where they left it unharvested, they just left it. They got 0.65. That makes sense, right? If you're just leaving the carbon, it should stay there. And where they grazed it, they got 1.4. Why does grazing stimulate soil carbon? That's a good question, and there's lots of theories. The animal tugging on the plant causes the root hairs to break off, and the root hairs can quickly be consumed by those microbes into the mineral-associated organic matter. So grazing can be very helpful. And why wouldn't it be? Because our prairie grasslands evolved with grazing. Okay, chapter 3. This study, I think, gets at the heart of a little bit of why you're here, right? You're drawn to the picture on the far right, where you have a wetland, where you have diversity. And what they did in this study is it's called White Oak Farms. You can look it up. And it was a research study by Roundtree et al., published 2 years ago, last year, where they looked at different ways to feed livestock and what was the impact on the environment. So on the left is your basic corn, soybean monocrop. Very efficient in producing lots of feed for barned animals. And then they went to different levels of diversity all the way to having multi-species grazing in a diverse landscape. Now, I have to warn you, the data is not all that hopeful by some. So our results indicate that this system, where they grazed cattle, pigs, chickens, and all together, ecological function, including soil health, resilience, and diversity. Accomplishes this by managing animals intensively, being threefold fewer. Graph on the right shows how much land was required to accomplish this. The red bar, green shows that the regenerative system with multi-species took more land. But I don't think that's a reason to abandon that and just model. Because there's ways of nuancing this, and there may be some intermediate system that people can manage. And the other thing we need to think about is that we have to be critically thinking about what is the world's population going to look like in the future. It is not going to continue to go up. This paper by Volset et al. Shows different projections. Popular projection is that the global population will maximize at 2064 and will decline after that. So yeah, we're going to reach about 9.5, maybe 9.8 billion by then, and then a number of different things could happen. I can't predict the future, but based on their models, the most aggressive model involved women's education around the world. If women get educated, if girls are allowed to go to school, they project a population of less than 7 billion by 2100. Because educated women have fewer children. That's just a fact. And so, that's fewer people than we have today. So this idea that we have to produce more and more that you hear from the agribusinesses is they have thought about it critically. They're not letting themselves think about it. And plus we're getting smart cities. There's, just many examples of how food production is changing. We're going to need agriculture in Manitoba, and we're always going to be an exporting nation because we are one of the world's breadbaskets, but we have to be realistic about what those markets might look like. The other thing in defense of an agricultural system that might be effective is how we use our land. Okay, here's a question for you. Do you think that the USA could improve the efficiency of their transportation system by 10%? How many, put up your hands if you think the United States could increase their efficiency by 10%. Yeah, it's not that hard. Well, that's 40% of their entire corn crop goes to ethanol, which produces 10% of their car gas. So if they improve their efficiency by 10%, that would free up an area twice the size of Ontario's agricultural area, 20 million acres. So there are things that we need to think about critically when you in your work present to your community some alternative model and they go, we got to feed the world. You could say, yeah, well, of course we do. We have to be responsible. But do you, let's think about this. Let's think about some other factors. Okay, I'm getting close to the end. This is the recipe for, let's get back to soil organic matter. This was the recipe for increasing soil organic matter. Lots of plants, healthy microbes, which means adequate nutrients for those microbes. I work on organic agriculture, and when you have a phosphorus deficient field, it's not productive. The problem is, it's not the end of the story. This system has a best before date. Sadly, I wish I could just quit here, but it's related to the elevation in the global temperature. The short end, as soils get warmer, they can hold on to less carbon because of more respiration. It's just a biological fact. If you go, 800 kilometers south of here, the soil organic carbon is lower. Go another 800 kilometers south, it's lower again. Go to the tropics, very little organic matter. Now, there's a lot of debates around, climate change, but I'm just talking here about the facts. I'm not talking about opinions. The graph on the bottom left shows the change in temperature since the Industrial Revolution. But if we go back 2,000 years, this is what ice cores have shown the temperatures have been. We have not seen in the last 2,000 years the elevation that we're experiencing right now. And we're asking ourselves, can we stop it at 1.5? We have to. Every degree matters. In that top graph, which goes back 2,000 years, you'll see the little ice age and the medieval warming. In the medieval warming, which happened in the medieval days, about 900 to 1200 or something like that, the temperature went up to about 1960s levels. And then we had the little ice age, and that had a huge disruptive effect on agriculture, including in the indigenous agriculture which existed here 1,000 years ago. Well, look at where the temperature is going now. We haven't been here before. And in Europe, what they've done is they've looked at the temperature projections. We will lose 10% of our mineral-associated organic matter in our arable soils, in our farmlands, just by temperature. Because temperature increases soil respiration, which means the soil has a much more difficult time hanging on to carbon. What does this mean? I think it means that your work is even more important. First of all, we have to revise our recipe for increasing soil organic matter. People talk about agriculture is going to sequester carbon and fight climate change. My friend Rennie Van Acker had this great saying, that dog don't hunt no more. That's not going to work. It's not enough because of the temperature projections. We're not going to be able to hang on to that carbon. We will increase our carbon for a while, and we can do better. We can do much better, and we should do much better. But we have to reduce emissions in other parts of our society very, very quickly. So this is the hopeful part. Regenerative landscapes should include a whole bunch of things that we're not doing right now. The island of Samso. I don't know if any of you have seen the Netflix show Islands of the Future. They have these 5 different islands off Europe that are all doing really interesting energy things. And the island of Samso is off the coast of Denmark. It's part of Denmark. And the Danish government went in and incentivized to try to make the island completely carbon neutral. This was 15 years ago. It's not new. And you can still see the Netflix show. You can look it up. You can go to the Google Island of Samso. And so they're doing biomass, they're doing wind generation, full of tidal energy, solar energy, and all those things. Biomass burning, anaerobic digestion. I think that when I saw the wind towers start going up in Manitoba, I said, it's really too bad that municipalities don't own those. If I were Minister Eichler, I would have fought to make sure that municipalities owned those things or had an ownership share. And maybe they do, and I don't know it. People that own land and people that communities, I think, should harvest that energy. Lethbridge biomass, Lethbridge Biogas, that's what the company is called. You can look it up online. They take dairy manure, put it into an anaerobic digester. Anaerobic digestion means methane comes off. You use the methane to produce electricity. And it's just CH4. So all the other nutrients stay in there. When you're finished that, the digestate, the leftover from the biodigester, becomes an organic fertilizer. There are biodigesters in Ontario. I think there's 45 farms that have these. And as soon as Doug Ford became premier, they cut the program, which is so stupid. This is the future. It's revenue for rural communities. It's revenue for farmers. I think it's really important. And the farmer there on just under the island of Samso, that's Brett Israel's. Really cool story. We work with them. They're an organic pig outside of Guelph. And the 78-year-old grandfather, instead of cashing out, which many older people do, he invested all his savings, transformed the whole farm to organic pig production, built new barns, repurposed it. They have about 1,000 acres of land. They're called 3-Gen Organics. Write that down. 3-Generation Organics. You can go online and listen to their story. They're using digestate from those anaerobic digesters. I think also that our landscapes, sometimes they need to be actually restored completely. And the picture in the top left is from China, is from northwest China, where the land was so degraded, they did a complete ecological restoration. And I have visited it a number of times. It's an area the size of France. And this man, John Louis, he's a Chinese-American filmmaker, become soil scientist, and he is involved in projects around the world, and you may want to learn more about him. I think his work kind of parallels what you're doing. It's really interesting. And then let's come right back to home and talk about wetlands. How many of you like wetlands? Okay, nobody. All right. Why are you here? This is very strange. Awesome. I'm almost done. One quick chapter after this. But wetland restoration, even though on an area basis, wetlands are carbon hotspots, right? Carbon just gets sucked into them, and wetland restoration has the potential to offset significant CO2 emissions. I've been teaching this for a while, challenging the students. I say, okay, everybody's excited about these autonomous seeders. Well, why don't have you considered using the autonomous seeders to actually go around, biodiversity strips and wetlands? And so we have a little project in my course where the students have to design these things. But autonomous seeders, self-driving seeders now exist. And so maybe there is some technology that can help you in your work to allow us not to drain the wetlands and maybe even create new ones by use of technology. Okay, my last chapter, just a couple of slides. Governance. I really feel for people like Minister Eichler and people in government. It's hard to make changes, especially when, the lowest price is the law and, Club Z points are sort of your currency. How do you invest in the future? Change is slow. And what I'm showing here is just the change in Northern European agriculture from 1500 to the 1944. The Europeans used to have a 2-crop rotation, fallow crop. Then they went to a 3-crop rotation, fallow, wheat or oats or rye, and then peas or beans, a legume. Transformative. It took about 300 years for that transition to happen because it was so political. It caused the peasant riots in Germany because now they were looking at a rotation like I'm showing there, fallow, oats or beans, and then wheat or rye. And it affected the common lands, or we could call it the community pasture, right? It changed society. And so, there were actually riots around this. And then eventually the Europeans went to the 4-crop rotation, which allowed the population to explode because now they were integrating animals. And then the 7-crop rotation, which is what my family practiced in Germany for hundreds of years. And then fertilizer came in and eliminated crop rotation. Go to Northern Europe now, winter canola, winter wheat, maybe some winter barley. So now, why is this important for Canada? I was looking for examples of where there's been innovation in governance, and this is the example that was interesting to me. The salmon fish farms on the West Coast have destroyed much of the native salmon because the salmon in the fish farms get lice, and those lice kill natural populations. And people have been documenting this for 25 years. The Canadian Fisheries and Oceans Department is incapable of regulating this. They have been unsuccessful. In the United States, Washington State has banned fish farms. In Europe, the fish farms killed the salmon. So what happened in Canada is they allowed the Indigenous people to take over. They said Indigenous laws and governance may be the only way that we can have a good outcome. I thought this was a very interesting post-colonial idea. And so maybe you want to explore that further. So as of next year, First Nations have to approve fish farms. If they want them, they can have them. They know what's going to happen, but they have some say in the matter. Another example, which I don't going to go into, people talked about how you do governance around wetlands. How do you create laws for wetlands? It's so difficult because they're so dispersed, right? I don't have a magic answer. So chapters, I hope I didn't go too much over time. Thank you. It was somewhat useful, and good luck in the rest of your comments. I don't know if there's time for some questions or discussion. If there is, that'd be great, but I think the chair is coming over here. Great. Yes.
Thank you very much, Dr. So, that we hoped it was. And we know that these more exotic technologies like direct air capture are very expensive. What biological options, I mean, also the optimized regenerative system isn't as productive in terms of calories. So we know that soil organic carbon there are limits to what we can do. We know that the optimized regenerative system doesn't produce as much calories as a conventional system. So given those constraints, what do we have left? Do we have the intensification of vertical farming and then the rural landscape becomes a forest garden? Like what do we have? What do we have left as our climate, net zero pathway that integrates regenerative agriculture? What do we do?
Okay, there's on the food supply side, food waste is going to fix that problem. I mean, it potentially can. We waste so much food. On the soil carbon, I just want to be very clear. Under the conditions that we have now, the soil carbon solution still works. As temperatures elevate, that's not going to work nearly as effectively, so it's been kind of oversold. I think the other thing that is important for food security, like I said, Canada, I believe, will always be an exporting nation. But we have to be very careful. We get very excited when we have a trade deal with Colombia to sell them beef. Well, what are we doing when that happens? We're putting their beef farmers out of business. The world has tremendous capacity to produce food in a sustainable way. We have to be careful not to limit those efforts. Another question up there. Okay, and the answer is quite positive. The fungicides are really not damaging. Okay, I guess I got cut off. Somebody, BASF. The news is positive, and it shows the resilience of the soil. If you look at what makes healthy soil, if you're using a fungicide in a healthy crop rotation, I think you're fine. After 200 years of this, we don't know. We haven't done that experiment. So we should be less cavalier maybe than we are. But very good question. Question here. Yeah. Okay, the question was other deep-rooted crops. I like the fact that you mentioned radish because any plant is good. Any plant is good. The roots will grow beyond 6, 8, 18 inches. Most of our roots grow, 3, 4 feet. But there are grasses, perennial grasses are not as deep rooting as alfalfa. Alfalfa is the deepest rooted plant that we grow. But sunflower is the deepest rooted annual crop that we grow, followed by corn, followed by canola, then wheat. Oats is a little bit deeper rooting than wheat. So I like the way you're thinking. The other option is to go with some tree species, agroforestry. Some of those tree species go very deep. And then one of the things that we're working on at the University of Manitoba is perennial, the idea of kernza or perennial wheat. So you can grow a perennial in your rotation that you can combine harvest. And if you go by the Glenley Research Station right now on the east side of the highway, there's about 30 acres of kernza, and there was cattle grazing it, so it's a dual-purpose crop. So sunflower, perennials, very good for the rooting. Yeah. Okay, is there a way to supercharge the microbiome? That's a great question. Yes, there is, and it's called a lot of that dissolved carbon coming out of plants. There's a lot of interest in what we like cynically call bug in a jug. Probably be useful in like a desert soil or a soil that had been seriously degraded. I've been to North Korea 3 times, and that soil is very degraded. It's just farmed out. And some inoculum, like a mycorrhizal inoculum or some bacteria, might be useful there. But in our soils here, there are already so many microbes. Really, to supercharge them, we need to feed them. So they're really already there. Even our mycorrhizal fungi, which are those beneficial fungi, they're in all of our soils here. They just need something to eat. So for example, mycorrhiza fungi, they only associate with living plants. So no-till is great, but when you see that, wheat stubble, canola stubble, middle of September in a field, farmers just come and spray glyphosate, good husbandry, get rid of those weeds. Now the mycorrhiza have nothing to eat because they associate with living plants. So their population starts growing down. So if you have some, barley volunteers, let them grow because they're feeding, they're supercharging those. It may sound like a very simplistic answer, but it's really how the prairie soils got so amazing in the first place. It's plants and perennial plants if possible. Is that the alarm? Okay, I think we're done.
Any more questions? Well, you know what? The chair is going to take the prerogative to ask one last question. Watershed districts, and we've got to involve water. What is the ratio, or shall we say the absorption between, or what's the rationale between carbon and moisture absorption in the soil, and have any tests been done on that?
Oh yeah, that's the answer is yes. The more organic matter, the bigger the sponge, the more water retention, very important. And in that Soil Health Institute study, where they looked at the 121 sites, they looked at exactly that relationship, and water retention from carbon is huge. So increasing carbon for water retention in the surface layer is very important, and then increasing carbon in the subsurface to allow water infiltration is also important. So I can't give you the 1-for-1 ratio, but I could make something up, but I don't want to.
Why not? Let's go with that. And I mean, that's one thing our former chair, Ray Fry, always talked about. We talk about storing water in retention areas, but probably the best place to store water is in the soil. So, and certainly as watershed districts, soil is a very important in how we treat that and retention of water and those things. And thank you very much. This was a very interesting conversation. Very, very good. And thank you so much for that.